What is text complexity and why is it important for science? Have you heard of building a strong base of knowledge through content-rich text? Have you heard of cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary or across content areas? Have you heard of text-dependent questions? Or academic versus domains or discipline-specific vocabulary? These are some of the themes of the Common Core standards for ELA that also have some strong ties to science. Before we jump into texts, what is rigor? Rigor is recognize realistic and relevant high-level expectations, integrate complexity, breadth, and depth in content, process, and product, generate cognitive skills, orchestrate support systems and scaffolding for success, and refine assessments to guide instruction and benefit learners. Using Hess's matrix, we can get an intersection of where DOK, or the depth of knowledge, and RBT, or Revised Bloom's taxonomy, meet. These two are related through their ties to complexity of thought, but their methods differ in scope and application. Bloom's taxonomy categorizes the cognitive skills required of the brain to perform a task, describing the types of thinking processes necessary to answer a question, whereas depth of knowledge, or DOK, relates more closely to the depth of content understanding and the scope of a learning activity, which manifests in the skills required to complete the task from inception to conclusion. DOK is not about verbs. Verbs are not always used appropriately. Also, it is not about difficulty, or about the student or level of difficulty for the student. It requires looking at an assessment item, not student work, in order to determine the level. Depth of knowledge is about what follows the verb. What comes after the verb? The verb is more important than the verb itself, and it is about the complexity of mental processing that must occur to answer a question. To summarize, DOK is not a taxonomy, it is nominative. Names and good tests need a range of DOK levels to provide accessibility to a range of students and their varying abilities. How does the rigor matrix apply to the content-rich informational text? First, there is a three-part model for measuring text complexity for students and the subject. The ELA standards presume that all three elements will come into play when text complexity and appropriateness are determined. The Common Core standards for ELA originally had 6 shifts listed here, but these have been since condensed into 3 key shifts, often referred to as simply informational text, use of evidence, and text complexity. Previously, what we learned about rigor is that it's not mutually exclusive. It is how deeply a student must engage in the content as well as what type of thinking is needed for the student to complete the task. DOK, again, is not about difficulty, it's about complexity. But what does rigor mean in the context of a text? Rigor is used in relation to text complexity. For example, rigor is also infused through the requirement that students read increasingly complex texts through the grades. For our Montana ELA Common Core standards, teachers who immerse their students in rich textual environments require increasing amounts of reading and help those students choose ever more challenging texts, and will essentially address rigor as defined in the Common Core. It is important for science, as science has connections across the domains. As we select complex texts in science, for science, we are also addressing the college and career goals for the English language arts. Complex texts also help provide context and connection. When students feel connections to content, they are more willing to wrestle with complex topics, texts, and questions. Text complexity is relevant to all readers, all teachers. Text complexity is never determined by a single characteristic, and teachers must make purposeful matches between text, task, and reader. The more difficult the task, the more difficult the concept, the more accessible the text should be. How can we unpack text complexity for science? We need to know what compromises text complexity and how to incorporate it purposefully into the classroom. It's not about just giving students harder tasks, but encouraging them to persevere with complex text and problem solving. This productive struggle is paramount to rigor. One way to start thinking about matching texts and readers is to begin with what you already have. Take a text that you teach frequently. Now consider how you would make that text more complex by changing the task or the questions. Criteria for determining increasing text complexity includes 8 factors that interact to affect the relative difficulty of text. These include the length of text, which impacts the ability of the students to sustain engagement with the text, the format and the layout of the text, which includes how the text is organized, its size, location of print, white space, graphics, etc., the genre and characteristic features of the text. When students have begun to generalize what is typical of a genre, they are better able to anticipate how information will be organized, thus supporting their comprehension when encountering new or unfamiliar texts. Purpose and level of reasoning required to interpret the author's purpose and message can be quite complex, while the actual words and sentence structure may appear on the surface to be very simplistic. Text structures. These are the internal organizational structures used within paragraphs or longer texts. Discourse style. This provides the view or author's perspective into style, voice, and sometimes potential biases, as well as adding more complex dimensions of language for readers to interpret. Word difficulty and language structure. This includes vocabulary and sentence type and the complexity of words or structure. Background knowledge and degree of familiarity with content. This is the prior information needed by the reader in order to understand the content, which will greatly inhibit or enhance the comprehension depending on the degree to which the student has read widely and discussed the text in the past, and how well they are prepared to read a text that might require additional background knowledge for deeper comprehension. Here's the text complexity rubric that we will use to look at these selected passages. Quantitative measures. Uses word frequency and sentence length to produce a single measure called a lexile. Use the research. Look at college and career-ready expectations for lexile, word count, and targets for each. These new lexiles meet the levels of complexity needed to meet the Common Core state standards and Smarter Balance guidelines for college and career readiness. Regardless of the readability, passage writers should select texts that cover a range of difficulty. Item writers must use good judgment and qualitative measure in selecting stimuli that are challenging and complex, but still appropriate and accessible to students. More about words and language features. Tier 1 words, words that rarely require instructional attention in school, familiar words with high frequency in everyday use. Tier 2 words, words with high utility determined by use and context, considered high frequency use for mature language users, found across a variety of domains and texts, and vary according to age and development. Tier 3 words, low-frequency words, often limited to content-specific domains like science, important to learn when the specific need arises, and critical for the content area learning, found most often in informational texts. Qualitative measures of text complexity. Using qualitative measures of text complexity involves making an informed decision about the difficulty of a text in terms of one or more factors discernible to a human reader. Qualitative measures, along with professional judgment in matching a text to a reader and task, serve as a necessary complement and sometimes a corrective means to quantitative measures. The teacher is crucial in making sure the task is a good match for the student. Know your students and their background knowledge. Provide good matches between the task and the text. So teachers must marry the reader and task, that is, have purpose on what we want our students to learn, and a clear understanding with purpose where we are able to connect the reader and task in a more purposeful way. Again, the more difficult the task, the more difficult the concept, the more accessible the text should be. As you can see, when we help our students build knowledge through content-rich informational texts, or obtain, evaluate, and communicate information, we as science educators can select rich informational texts to increase comprehension, student engagement, and authenticity in our instruction. For these reasons, content-rich informational texts have been selected for our POW Science work.